I didn't think anything that I was doing at my age was strange or odd.
Gonzo, the Coast Guard Years, Boston, Episode 2, Learning the Ropes and PMs.
My first day at EMD was like most other times when you're brand spanking new. I didn't know shit, and the flood of information was way more than this 20-year-old brain could absorb. That's right, I was 20, and holy crap, honestly, I didn't think anything that I was doing at my age was strange or odd. Mostly because everybody I knew in the Coast Guard, most everybody I knew was about the same age as I was. But looking back at it all, probably a little bit unfairly now, the 20-something-year-olds that I know today, it blows my mind to think that they would be doing or could be doing what I was doing. It's not to say that they couldn't, but honestly, I'm shocked thinking back to what I was doing. Yeah, I couldn't imagine somebody I know now who's 20-something years old doing any of that stuff. And I was also mostly unsupervised. But it's kind of like, when you're growing up and, if you screwed up, your parents were going to get on you. So that was this case, but way worse, because if I got into trouble, if I fucked up, man, would I get it. And so I guess that's, I don't know why I'm babbling about that now. We had choices. So I guess I made good choices and good decisions, but like all of my own. It's weird thinking about it now. Back to EMD. I had learned that most of the guys at EMD were all there temporarily and waiting to go to a ship. A big white one, just like me. So at the time, as I mentioned in the previous episode, there were a few ships already home ported in Boston. They were mostly 270s. And I think it was I don't know if these ships are still there. I suppose I could look it up, but why would I want to do that? There was the Seneca, the Escanaba, and I think the other 270 was the Spencer. There was also a 378, and that was the Hamilton. At least I think that was the one that was there. And there was also a 210, and I don't even remotely recall the name of that. I mean, I could make up a 270 that I knew, but that would be foolish. I mean, 210. Just for reference, the 210s and the 270s were all medium endurance cutters, while the Hamilton was a high endurance cutter. Basically a 378 feet long, could stay out to sea way longer. They were more self-sufficient and basically could stay out there for longer periods of time, and which meant for the crew, those poor bastards, that they had to stay out there way longer than somebody on a 210 or a 270. Speaking solely for myself, any day out to sea was way too long. Sorry about that. So I kind of went off on a tangent there. The team at EMD, including myself, we were a bit of an odd and funny bunch. I mean, by most people's standards, I think the stuff that we got into was mild by comparison. So we didn't do like massively stupid shit, at least by most people's standards. And besides, me being 20 years old and change, I was always thinking, how the hell could I do something really messed up and still have plausible deniability? It's teenage thinking. It's stuff, how you'd always say, I'm going to go to a friend's house to spend the night, when really you were out doing something really stupid and you were hoping your parents wouldn't catch you. That was always thinking that was still going on in my head, which, I was 20. I was barely out of my teens. I was still a kid. I don't recall the day, but it was within the first week or so that I would end up meeting Keith Keith would end up being my introduction into the wonderful world of being in the U.S. Coast Guard, or an ET in the U.S. Coast Guard. But on behalf of the Coast Guard, that was a terrible thing to have happened. However, Keith and I would go on to be really great friends. Keith was from Avon Lake, Ohio. He had a couple brothers that were also in the Coast Guard, and I ended up meeting them too on different occasions. But I think he had a total of 4 or 5 brothers in all, and he had an older sister who I also ended up meeting. And no, it was nothing weird or anything like that. So you people thinking that, just cool your jets. Usually Keith could always be seen with a guy named John. I don't know if I ever learned where John was from, but I do know that I think John ended up staying in the Massachusetts region when he eventually got out of the Coast Guard. But I don't know. Those two were basically tied at the hip. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing the other. And if they weren't together, that's usually because one of them was on duty or out of town, or they somehow managed to get bored of each other. Keith and John were roommates, and they lived right down I eventually moved into a room right down the hall from them. So I did see them all the time when we were at work and when we weren't at work. Also, Keith and John were a year and change older than me, which meant they went to the on-base enlisted club and I didn't go. Also, at the enlisted club, there was an old immigration detention center above the enlisted men's club. I had a real name or something like that for it, but the enlisted club. Again, so the detention center was right above it. Basically, it's kind of like a jail for detainees. So one fine Coast Guard morning at the good old EMD, it was time to actually do some ET shit. It was also the day, as I mentioned earlier, that I had first met Keith. The chief, who was down on the main floor with us, usually handed out the assignments and whatnot. And as an ET at EMD Support Center Boston, most of what we did was busy work. Or rather, work that the ETs on the ships didn't want to do or didn't have time to do, but I'm pretty sure they just didn't want to do it. So the chief told Keith to take me with him to go over to one of the 270s. I felt like it was the Escanaba, but it could have been the Spencer that we went to. And it didn't really matter because, they were all configured essentially the same way. And the weird thing is, this was the first ship that I was going on, the first big white one that I was going on, where I wasn't a seaman. I was an actual ET. It was weird. And so I was going on the ship and I was going to be doing ET shit, not decade shit, which is cool. It wasn't punk ass anymore. I was still a punk ass. I was like 20. Although, so going on the ship, though, I did not feel like an ET at all. I do remember eventually when I got on the ship that I was like scoping out all the, the deck stuff to make sure it was all in proper order. And yeah, like I knew I was on the Thetis, and we were all a little ass backwards there. But anyway, I just remember how weird it felt, but at the same time, it was pretty damn cool. I was no longer a seaman on the 270. On the way over to the ship, Keith was asking me, we were making small talk, so he was asking me about myself and whatnot, and where I was coming from, and where I'd been stationed, and all that kind of stuff. And if I remember correctly, Keith was my height, maybe a little shorter, a little taller than I was. Of course, he had short blonde hair like you'd expect somebody in the Coast Guard to have. And by that, I mean he had short hair, not that he had, not that everyone had short blonde hair, but maybe that's the thing. I don't know. Yeah, so anyway, He wore glasses and he had this infectious personality. And for the most part, he was always smiling and always in a good mood, or he could turn it on real fast. Although he was smiling an awful lot, he wasn't necessarily the funniest one of the bunch. That was Greg, or Ken. And I'll talk about both of those dudes sometime later. But Keith could be friends with just about anyone. Or if not friends, he was just super friendly with everyone. And he meant it too, which was weird because, Keith kind of reminded you of like a super smooth sales guy. And sometimes he would say stuff that was so out in left field, but kind of be all, smooth and stuff. People knew he was full of shit, but that was kind of like his charm. People would just roll with it because he was, that's just how he was. It was weird. When he wasn't out in public, he could turn it off. And when he was behind closed doors, when he let his guard down, he was kind of a different person. He was just super chill, relaxed, and can be a little bit more serious when he wasn't having to be on. So when we got to the ship, whichever one it was, we headed straight for the quarterdeck and did the whole salute thing, salute the flag and salute the quarterdeck, and made our way to the AT shop. But the quarterdeck guy, I think, called the AT shop and told them we were on the way. On the Coast Guard 270, AT shop sits in the back of an area known as Combat Information Center. Or was it Command Information Center? I don't remember. But who cares? It's actually, no, I think we called it CSC, Combat Support Center, or Command Support Center. But whatever. It didn't matter. We went there and to do our ET stuff. So to digress here a little bit, as a seaman on a 270, there is a low probability you would ever be allowed to go into this particular space. And this was going to be my very first time walking into, one of these spaces. So I was all giddy as shit. And I'm like, hey, I'm going into this really cool place that I'd never seen before. And I'd been all over 270 on the Thetis. Back when I was supposed to be mapping out the fire main and all that kind of stuff, I was in all kinds of cool places. But anyway, being the new guy, I didn't have much to say about anything. I just sort of walked around and tried not to make a fool out of myself. Whereas Keith, who could talk to anybody, he knew the particular ET that we were going to be working with or working for, as the case may be. And he explained we were there to help them out with PMs. PMs, which is preventive maintenance. PMs basically is what you do. You're taking care of your stuff. It's kind of like when you get an oil change, get your filters changed in your car and stuff like that. Just regular maintenance. So stuff eventually breaks anyway, but it was to help things run smoother. So that's what we did. We did a lot of preventive maintenance, and it's the stuff that the ETs were supposed to do when they got back in port. But as I was to find out much later, there were usually things that required more of your attention than doing preventive maintenance when you got back into port. It was fixing stuff, gearing up for the next patrol, and that's why they had people like us to do all their stuff. So the ET that Keith was talking to got the skinny on me that I was the new guy, and Keith was being Keith and told him he was showing me around and all that kind of cool stuff. And, he kind of sounded like a politician, just how smooth he was. And that's not meant to be a bad thing. Keith's one of the coolest guys I'd ever met. But anyway, he just kind of sounded funny and ridiculous all at the same time. I got the impression based on their conversation that Keith and this ET knew each other pretty well. After initial conversation, the ET gave Keith a set of laminated cards that were about twice the size of a regular index card. And these laminated cards detailed out what piece of equipment or gear we were supposed to work on and what the specific maintenance or preventive maintenance that was supposed to be done. And it had the frequency of the maintenance and kind of basically detailed out what needed to be done. It was pretty much idiot proof. Remember I said that, idiot proof. But there was also the assumption, though, that you knew what you were doing or someone was going to be training you on what you were supposed to be doing, which is what I expected Keith would be doing. Yep. Have no fear. I had Keith to show me the ropes. If you're sensing a little sarcasm, you would be right. So today's PMs, we had to clean some trackballs on some console that had some displays and buttons and stuff that I had no idea what they did. I did learn later that the displays would project what was actually happening on a radar that was positioned somewhere else, which all seemed really cool to me. I just had no idea what any of it really meant and what it was for. I mean, I did find out about radars, which I'll talk about in another episode or something like that. Like very soon, so you don't have to wait too long. The ET gave us a few tools from the ET shop, gave us the PM cards, and told Keith where to start. So we plopped down in front of these consoles. We proceeded to remove and disassemble the trackballs from the console. Now, this next part may bore the crap out of you, but it's important. The housing on the trackballs is big, bulky thing with like a bazillion screws and all kinds of different types of washers. You had flat ones, locking ones, little plastic ones. Also, the trackball was white, about the size of a cue ball, maybe a little smaller than a billiards cue ball or you know what I mean. If you don't know what billiards are or pool is, then you need to get out more often. So we took apart these trackballs and essentially we wiped the balls clean. That's what we did. We cleaned the balls. And during this time, I'm sorry, that made me laugh. While we were, taking apart and cleaning the balls and cleaning all the other pieces, Keith and I talked a lot. What we talked about, I don't remember. But I do remember it was a fun conversation. During the conversation, I realized that he was probably a little crazy. He was really crazy, but in all the best ways possible. Eventually, after we were done cleaning the balls and we put them back together, on the console there was basically these cup holders that were built into the console, and it's where I had been putting like the washers and stuff. So after I had everything all buttoned back up again, I don't know what possessed me to look in the cup holder, but I remember going, oh, I realized I had extra pieces. I had extra washers left over. Inside, I had a little bit of a panic. I'm like, fuck, I screwed up my very first real ET assignment. I couldn't even take something apart and put it back together again. I had screwed up. I looked over at Keith and just said, I looked over at him and he looked back at me and said, oh, but in a super exaggerated way. And so I told him what happened. He said, give him the pieces. So I gave him the washers. He looked at him for a second and was like, oh, and he just put him in his pocket. I know I was a bit shocked. He just looked at me and said, don't worry about it. So we finished up, gave the PM cards back to the ET. So, and then we went outside on the port side of the ship because we were going to be taking the ladder steps down the port side of the ship. And then we were going to leave and we were going to head back to EMD. But we hung out on the port side for just a little bit. We kind of stopped and we were taking in a view across the harbor. We're like sort of leaning on like this fiberglass railing, which was really sturdy. When I always heard fiberglass, I always thought it was going to be very fragile. These things were solid. Keith just kind of casually reached into his pocket and took out the extra little pieces and just sort of let them slip out of his hand. Of course, we both kind of looked over, saw them hit the water, and he just looked over at me with this shit-eating grin. Like, yeah, okay. And we both just headed off like it was the most normal thing that could possibly happen. I knew right then and there that either Keith was just a fucking whack job or he was taking a risk with the FNG and putting just a bit of trust in me that I wouldn't. Yeah, that was cool. That was cool. This all happened like over 30 years ago. I wonder if anyone actually ever realized that they were missing some washers. I wonder if Keith actually ended up with that particular 270. Honestly, I do need to call him and ask if that was, he probably doesn't remember because only I remember this bullshit like this. It was probably around lunchtime when we left the ship or earlier, and we headed back to the shop, as we typically referred to it at EMD. We were usually left up to our own devices after we had our assignments. Pretty sure the chief that gave out the assignments really didn't care what we did so long as we stayed out of trouble. And by that, I mean he just wanted to make sure we didn't cause him any trouble. And to the best of my knowledge, we were all pretty well behaved. Except one dude who sort of got himself into a real mess, but more on that later. If I can remember about it, that is. I'm sure I'll remember because it was a doozy. After leaving the ship, the Spencer or the Escanaba, whatever it was, it ended up being what I would call a typical day for us at EMD. We would go back to the shop, as I said, and we would check in real quick. Basically, it was a way to figure out who was there, who we could hang out with. And then after we left EMD, we would do a quick roam around the base, making our rounds, as Keith would like to say. Somehow that we always felt like that would be an excuse. We were making our rounds around the base. We didn't make rounds around the base. Well, actually, I think Keith did many months later. He ended up becoming like junior officer of the day, which meant he had fewer watches than I did. I think I stood watch once or twice the entire time I was at EMD or Support Center Boston because they didn't know about me at all. And I don't know how they found out that I wasn't in the watch rotation, but that was kind of a bummer. Actually, as a matter of fact, I think Keith may have ratted me out because, I bet he did, that big old meanie. But anyway, after we did our rounds around the base, we would, sometimes we'd go to lunch, and sometimes lunch really meant it was nap time. And we would head back to our rooms and take a nap. And if we didn't take a nap, we would just sit there and hang out and talk trash in our rooms. Basically, something you would expect a early 20s person to be doing who had a lot of time on his hands and didn't want to get in trouble or was trying to stay out of trouble, that is. So before the day was out, we would normally make one more trip back to EMD after lunch, just, again, to see who was there. If there was something to plan on our social calendar or whatever. I mean, it was just killing time and just hanging out with other people, basically our age. But at the end of the day, we would all basically head back to our rooms until it was time for dinner. And I don't know, I seem to think dinner was probably around 4:30 or something like that. It was really early. Yeah, honestly, I don't remember when dinner was, but it wasn't late. So anyway, we would head back to our rooms to kill some time. So when I first got to Support Center Boston, they had stuck me in a temporary room before I moved closer to Keith's room, which that too was a whole story about me getting into that room and stuff. But anyway, so I was rooming near the top floor in this really old decrepit building, and I had two other roommates who were obviously in the Coast Guard, just like me. If I remember correctly, they were both sonar technicians. I don't know if they were E3s or E2s, but they'd been around for a bit. A sonar tech or an ST in the Coast Guard pretty much meant you were going to be spending the bulk of your time on a 378 endurance cutter, high endurance cutter, or possibly one of the icebreakers. Yes, I said icebreakers. the Coast Guard actually had a few of those icebreakers. I mean, they were really big, and they had red holes instead of the white ones that the standard Coast Guard cutter had. So there's a couple of them. Well, basically, they would go to places where there was ice. Basically, they traveled around the world, usually up in the Arctic areas and whatnot. They would have a team of scientists and researchers and really cool stuff, and they would take these people to do scientific shit. There were also buoy tender icebreakers, and I don't know for sure, but I think they had a few of those in the Great Lakes and up and down the St. Lawrence River. That's the river that borders the U.S. and Canada. Buoy tenders were black-hulled boats, and those were some hardcore boats or ships because they were like real working boats. Real quick, so I'm sorry. I think I was bouncing back between boats and ships. Your average coastie usually referred to his ship as the boat when he was talking about the ship that he was assigned to. So I don't know why we said it. We just said it. And even though technically speaking, they were ships if they were 95 feet and bigger, but we always call it the boat. I don't know why, but everybody in the Coast Guard did it. And it's just a thing. But anyway, I think Keith was on a buoy tender. Yeah, I don't know what he did there. Maybe he was like a stock boy or something at an admin office. I don't know. So anyway, my roommates were both sonar techs, and I didn't spend any time with them actually outside of being in the room. And they were hardly ever there anyway. And I'm pretty sure one of them or both of them was eventually getting assigned to the Hamilton. That was the big 378 that was homeported in Boston. Or I think it was the 370. But anyway, I think both of them were, again, waiting to just hang out to go to 378. One of the dudes had a computer, and it might have been like a Commodore or something or other, and he was always on it. He wasn't like doing anything, Coast Guard-y on it, unless you count playing a video game called Red Storm Rising, or I think that's what it's called. And well, as you can imagine, if you don't know the book Red Storm Rising, this game was essentially a submarine type game. And so my roommate, the one that played the video games, was from Charleston, South Carolina. He typically said things that I honestly had no idea where he came up with them. Pretty sure it was something that he'd picked up back home in South Carolina. But the one thing he said that to this day I have not forgotten, and I say it quite often. But first, just a little context. I know the suspense is going to kill you all. I apologize. The saying was usually used when he was surprised about something, or something surprised him, or something unexpected happened. So that's some context. So one day, Keith came to my room just to hang out and BS for a little while. This one day, Keith decided, for no apparent reason other than it was something to do, so he happened to have a Bic lighter. And no, he didn't smoke, so I don't know why he had a Bic lighter on him, but he had a lighter on him. I kind of think that maybe he had planned this all along. So we had these chairs in our room, and they were made of they were old, crappy wood furniture, and they had this really ugly, gross sort of fabric on them. And, it had a little bit of cushion, but they were really super old, so who knows? So Keith is sitting on this chair, and he slides his butt to the edge of the chair, and then he pulls his legs up like he's about ready to give birth, and he's got his feet up in the stirrups, whatever. You see, Keith decided to light his fart on fire. He took the lighter and he lit it underneath or right in front of his ass, and he let it rip. And then, poof, flame shot out of his ass. And of course, we all started laughing. But Keith's going, holy shit, my ass is on fire. Because I guess he burned himself a little bit, or just got a little hot. And the timing couldn't have been any more perfect, because it was right about then that my roommate walked in, the one from South Carolina, and he blurted out, Well, I'll be shouting down south and beating you behind with the watermelon rind.
You've been listening to Gonzo the Coast Guard Ears, written and produced by Tim Gonzalez, and I'm Nicholas Gonzalez, the voice guy. This episode was produced by Mislaid Productions.
Now, where did I put that thing?